All right, so we've looked at the three different types of rain, where we find these rains, and in which season these rains come in. So last thing that we need to look at is how these rains form. All right, so before we get into each individual type of rain, it's important to note that all types of rainfall have these three things in common. So in order for rain to happen, you have to have warm air that rises, so this is known as evaporation, and as that air moves further and further up into the atmosphere, so increase in altitude, it will eventually reach a point where the temperature becomes too cold for this warm air to rise, and this will cause condensation. So this is when the water vapor cools down and actually becomes liquid water drops, and this is what we call clouds. So when this happens a lot and a lot and a lot, then the clouds will get heavier and heavier and heavier, and eventually it will rain. Type of rainfall. For your exam, you will have to know how to draw these rainfalls as well as describe how it happens. Okay, so for convectional rainfall, we have the warm sun that brings in very, very intense solar radiation, which heats the ground. That ground causes the air above it to also become very warm, and so the warm air rises. And then, as seen in the previous slide, it gets to a certain temperature where it cools, condenses, and forms clouds. Now, remember, these convectional clouds are huge, called cumulonimbus clouds. You don't need to know that just yet. And this often results in thunderstorms in these areas. All right. Next up, relief rain. So as we saw earlier, usually from a warm ocean, which brings warm, moist air. Then relief rain has got to do with mountains. So this warm, moist air gets pushed up against the side of the mountain, cools when it gets to a certain altitude, condenses and forms clouds, and then this causes rain. So what's interesting about relief rain is usually one side of the mountain will have lots and lots and lots of vegetation and plants on it, while the other side of the mountain is actually very, very dry. So a very good example of this is actually the Mount Everest by India. So we'll have a look at that in the next slide. And then lastly, for frontal rainfall, you have a cold mass of air that meets with a warm mass of air. Because colder air is more dense, it's more heavier than the warm air is pushed up against the cold front air, and then, as with all the other rains, it will reach a certain altitude in the sky where the temperature drops. This cools, condenses, and forms rain. All right, another example of relief rain can also be found in India, across the Indian Ocean. So the warm ocean currents come from the equator, pushed over India's landmass, reaches the mountain range where Mount Everest is. That warm, moist air gets pushed up the mountain range, cools, condenses, and forms rain on the one side of the mountain range. So here it's very easy to see that on the one side we have much more tropical vegetation. It's lush. You can see from Street View that there's tons of Street View available, meaning that there's lots of people living on this side or visiting this side. However, when we move over to the other side of the mountain, so when we move over to the leeward side of the mountain, the other side of the mountain, then you can see that it is very, very, very dry on this side. And if we look at Street View, there's just like not that much Street View available at all. Not many people want to live here or go visit here. So the other side, where the wind is, the moist air, that's called the windward side. And then this dry side over here is called the leeward side of the mountain. All right, so once you've gone through this slideshow, please make sure that you've checked on Google Classroom for these three PDFs for the three different types of rain. Please make sure that you have redrawn the formation of each type of rain into your books, as well as the short steps on how these rains form. This is very important for your exam coming up. You will need to be able to label these and or draw these type of rainfalls.